In this gripping story, Mrs. Wilkins, an elderly woman who has recently lost her hearing, sets off to visit her daughter. What begins as a simple drive turns into a nightmare when she encounters Officer Jackson, whose unchecked authority leads to a life-threatening situation. Stay tuned to uncover how this harrowing tale begins and the shocking twists that follow. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe now to keep enjoying the content. Mrs. Wilkins sat in her modest living room, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow through the lace curtains. She was knitting a scarf for her grandson when her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her daughter, Lisa, who lived in the city. "Mom, I need you to come stay with us for a while. The kids miss you, and I could use some help around the house," the message read. Mrs. Wilkins smiled, her heart swelling with love for her family. She quickly packed a small suitcase and prepared for the drive to the city. Little did she know, this journey would change her life forever. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town of Brooksville when Officer Jackson pulled his cruiser onto the deserted road. His eyes scanned the traffic, searching for any sign of trouble. As he approached an old sedan, his brow furrowed, and his hand instinctively moved towards his holster. "Pull over," he barked, the commanding tone echoing through the silent morning air. The driver, an elderly black woman, looked startled and confused, but she complied, guiding her car to the side of the road. Officer Jackson approached the vehicle, his jaw set in a determined line. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The woman, Mrs. Wilkins, tried to explain, her hands gesturing wildly, but the officer ignored her. "License and registration," Jackson demanded, his tone harsh. Mrs. Wilkins reached into her purse, her hands trembling. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. "I recently had an accident that left me deaf," the message read. Officer Jackson glanced at the screen, but without a moment's hesitation, he crushed the phone under his boot, his face contorted with rage. "You're not listening to me, are you?" he shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. He grabbed Mrs. Wilkins by the arm, yanking her out of the car with such force that she cried out in pain. Michael, a close friend of the sheriff, had decided to take a late-night stroll, seeking solace in the quiet streets. As he wandered aimlessly, a sudden commotion caught his attention, drawing him closer to the source of the disturbance. Cautiously, Michael approached the scene, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and unease. To his horror, he witnessed a sight that would forever haunt him. A policeman, his uniform, was aggressively assaulting a woman. Michael squinted his eyes, trying to make out the victim's identity, and the realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. "Mrs. Wilkins," he gasped, his voice trembling with disbelief. The sheriff's mother, a woman he had known and respected for years, was being brutalized by one of her own. Without hesitation, Michael reached for his phone and dialed the sheriff's number, his fingers shaking with urgency. "Sheriff, you need to get here, now," he pleaded, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It's your mother, she's being attacked by one of your own." The sheriff, his heart racing, wasted no time. Within minutes, the roar of his patrol car echoed through the empty streets, and he came screeching to a halt, his eyes widening in disbelief at the sight that greeted him. "What the hell is going on here?" the sheriff bellowed, his voice laced with a mixture of shock and outrage, seeing his mother tremble, her eyes filled with fear and anguish. "Officer Jackson! What are you doing?" a voice boomed from behind him, and he froze, his grip on Mrs. Wilkins tightening. Turning slowly, Officer Jackson found himself face to face with the sheriff, a man he had known and respected for years. "Sheriff," he stammered, his confidence faltering. "What in the blazes do you think you're doing to my mother?" the sheriff demanded, his eyes blazing with fury. Officer Jackson felt the color drain from his face as he realized the gravity of his actions. The sheriff's eyes bore into Officer Jackson's, a mixture of anger and disappointment evident in his gaze. "Release her. Now," he commanded. Jackson reluctantly let go of Mrs. Wilkins, who stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. The sheriff stepped forward, placing a protective arm around his mother. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad and pen, quickly scribbling a message. "I'm fine, just shaken. Thank you for coming." "Officer Jackson," the sheriff barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What was the meaning of this? Why were you choking an innocent woman?" Officer Jackson stood before the sheriff, his hands trembling, his uniform disheveled. I don't know, Sheriff," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what came over me. She didn't do anything wrong." The sheriff's eyes widened, his disbelief evident. "What crime did she commit? What law did she break?" he demanded, his voice laced with anger and confusion. Officer Jackson shook his head, his eyes downcast. There was no crime, Sheriff. I don't know what happened. I'm so sorry." The sheriff's expression hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Sorry," he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "You are a criminal, Officer Jackson, and you deserve to be fired and locked up for your actions." The crowd erupted into a chorus of murmurs and gasps, the tension in the air tangible. Officer Jackson stood there, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. "Please, Sheriff," he begged, his voice trembling. I don't know what happened. It was like I lost control. I never meant to hurt her. I'm so sorry. I did not know she was your mother." Subscribe now to keep enjoying the content. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his gaze unwavering. "Your apologies mean nothing to me, Officer Jackson," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You have betrayed the trust of this community, and you will face the consequences of your actions. You will be suspended immediately pending an investigation," he said coldly. As the sirens of backup units filled the air, Michael stood by, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. The once peaceful town of Brooksville had been shaken to its core, and the betrayal of one of their own had left an indelible mark on the community. The air was heavy, the silence deafening, as the sheriff's words cut through the stillness. "Due to the gravity of the situation, I'm ordering that you be locked up in a cell for a day while we continue our investigation," the sheriff said, his voice stern yet laced with a hint of disappointment. Officer Jackson felt the bile rise in his throat as he slowly removed his badge and weapon, handing them over to the sheriff. The metal burned his palm, a tangible reminder of the trust he had betrayed. His face was a mask of regret, the realization that he had jeopardized his career and reputation a painful pill to swallow. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen." The sheriff sighed, his weathered features etched with a mixture of disappointment and empathy. "I know, officer. But the law is the law, and we have to follow it, no matter how difficult it may be." As the crowd watched in stunned silence, the sheriff and her mother turned and walked away, leaving Officer Jackson to face the consequences of his actions, his future uncertain, and his past forever tainted by the weight of his mistake. As Officer Jackson was led away, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the dimly lit hallway, each step a nail in the coffin of his once promising career. The cell door slammed shut, the finality of the sound sending a shiver down his spine. Alone in the confines of the small room, Officer Jackson sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the trust he had betrayed and the consequences he now faced. Outside, the town buzzed with whispers and speculation, the news of the respected officer's fall from grace spreading like wildfire. The officer in charge of the investigations stood at his desk, poring over the evidence, his brow furrowed with concentration. He knew that the investigation would be arduous, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. As the night fell, Officer Jackson stared at the bars that separated him from the world he once knew, his heart heavy with regret. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and now he found himself on the other side of the law, a fallen shield in the face of justice. The shocking incident between Officer Jackson and Mrs. Wilkins serves as a stark reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and the responsible use of power. It highlights the critical need for law enforcement officers to exercise patience and restraint, especially when dealing with vulnerable individuals. The story underscores the devastating consequences of prejudice and unchecked authority, and the importance of accountability within the justice system. It teaches us that respect for human dignity must always be at the forefront of our actions, and that the abuse of power can lead to irreversible harm and a loss of trust within the community. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to help our channel grow.